Parsha, sparks, tidbits on the weekly Torah portion. This week, the Parsha, the Torah portion, is Vaeira, and we're going to be dedicating this class to the memory of Adar Shimon, Reb Aryeh Mendel, Olav Hashem. This Parsha is the beginning of a series of what we know as the 10 plagues. But before we go into the 10 plagues, let's just focus on the first important word, the name of the Parsha, Vaeira. And I appeared, God says to Moshe, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I made a covenant with them, and so on and so forth. But just the word Vaeira has the word or in it, light, and another aleph, which is the initial of the word or, which is light. So you have a hint to a double light. And when we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, that introduced a powerful surge of divine light that took the Jews out of Egypt. But there's also a connection to today. Today, the 24th day of the month of Tevis, is the anniversary of the passing of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the first Rebbe, a leader of Chabad, whose name was Shneor. He had two names, Shneor Zalman, but Shneor means two lights. The origin of the name is that there was once a person who wanted to name his son after one grandfather whose name was Meir, which means light, and another grandfather whose name was Uri, which is also my light. And there was a question, what name should he give, Meir or Uri? I guess in those days it was not common to give two names. He could have named him Meir Uri, but instead he named him Shneor, which means two lights. Well, the Alter Rebbe was named Shneor, and the name was given to him at the behest of the Baal Shem Tov. When his father and mother came to the Baal Shem Tov, they were told by him that their child will illuminate the world with two lights. Not one light, but two lights. The light of the revealed part of Torah, the laws of the Torah, and the light of the inner dimension of the Torah, the mystical teachings. He wrote the Shulchan Aruch, an updated version of the Code of Jewish Law, which illuminates Jewish law, which is the revealed part of Torah, the one that tells us what to do, how to behave, how to live our lives. And he also wrote the Tanya, among many other works of Hasidic philosophy, which illuminates us through the inner light of Torah, the inner dimension of Torah. And that's all hinted in the word Vaeira, which always corresponds to the day of his yahrzeit. What is so special about a yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing? Well, Hasidic thought tells us that whatever good that a person does, they generate light, divine light, energy, and it never leaves. But it's not necessarily going to be fully revealed. But on the day that a person passes away, and then every yahrzeit, every anniversary of that day, all of the person's positive accomplishments, all of the energy that they generate, all of the light is regenerated, and that creates a powerful force in the world. And we could be the beneficiaries of that light, especially when we open ourselves up to the teachings of that person, and in this case, the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Tanya. God says to Moses that I have heard the cries of the Jewish people. I remembered my covenant I made with them. Therefore, he says, tell the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, and he tells them four things, which essentially are one and the same. Four different ways of saying the same thing, that I will free them, I will liberate them. And it uses four different expressions. I will take them out of the hard work of Egypt. I will save them from their work. I will redeem them with an outstretched arm. And I will take them unto me as a nation. So here are 4 different expressions that all denote being freed from Egyptian bondage. And because of these 4 different expressions, the rabbis instituted at the Seder that we drink 4 cups of wine. And we make a separate blessing for each of the 4 cups because there are 4 different expressions of redemption. But that just begs the question, if going out of Egypt is simply going out of Egypt, being redeemed, then there should be 1 expression. Is this just an excuse to be able to drink 4 cups of wine? Obviously, there are 4 different dimensions of redemption. So let's go through the 4 stages on a very simple level. The first stage of redemption was to liberate the Jews from the back-breaking, punishing slavery that they were subjected to. It wasn't just that they were not free, that they were lacking and deprived of freedom, but they were tortured by the type of work they were given. As we discussed last week, they were told to do things that were against their nature. They would do things that would not endure, so they didn't even get the satisfaction. They were beaten mercilessly. Children were crushed into the mortar. And I don't want to get more graphic than that, but it was horrible. It was unbearable. So the first level of freedom is to release them from this torture to which they were subjected. But then they were still slaves. You could be a slave and not be tortured. That was the second expression. They were liberated from their state of slavery. They were no longer slaves. The Talmud tells us that a half year before the Exodus, that is from Rosh Hashanah onward, the Jews were no longer slaves to the Egyptians. That was a second power of redemption. But then you could still be a person who is not totally in charge of their lives because they're still captives in the land of Egypt. And of course, we don't have to go that far back in history to see a parallel to that. The Jews in the Soviet Union, many of them were tortured, many of them were slaves, were imprisoned, but the majority of them were not, but they were still not free to leave the country. They weren't free to practice Judaism and live as Jews in the Soviet Union, and they were not free to leave. They couldn't emigrate. And thank God we no longer have the Soviet Union. That's one of the greatest modern-day miracles, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that's a separate subject. So you have, number 1, the liberation from torture. Number 2, the liberation from slavery. Number 3, the liberation from Egypt. They were now free to leave Egypt. That's only 3. Why do we need a 4th? And the answer is, without the 4th, the other 3 have no real enduring value. Because the 4th is where God says, I will take them unto me as a nation. That's when God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. That was the ultimate act of freedom. Because when a person is free in the sense that they have no master over them, they will become slaves without even realizing it. They will become slaves to the culture in which they live. They will become slaves to their evil impulses, so it can be slaves to something internal or external. They will lose their independence. They will become slaves to whatever it is that is in vogue at that particular time. And they're not really free. While they think they're free, they become addicted. An addict is able to indulge, but not because he's free, but because he has become a slave to the drug or whatever it is to which one is addicted. So the 4th expression of redemption is where we became a full-fledged nation at Mount Sinai, where God took us as his nation. But then there's a 5th expression that somehow doesn't get that much attention, where it says in the next verse, this is in chapter 6, verse 8, and I will take them to the land that I had sworn to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'll give them as an inheritance. So that would mean that there is a 5th expression of redemption, because it's not enough that we receive the Torah. We have to be in our land, because that's the only place where all of the teachings of the Torah can be implemented. But, alas, Even after we came to the land, 10 tribes were driven off of the land. When that happened, many of the commandments in the Torah could no longer be practiced, because in order to observe the laws of the Jubilee year, for example, and many other related laws, you have to have the majority of Jews living in Israel. When the 10 tribes were exiled, that ceased to be the case. So Judaism and the implementation of Torah was now compromised by circumstances that took away the strength of being in our own land. And to this moment, that has not changed. We still do not have the majority of the Jews living in Egypt, living in Israel, I should say, and we can no longer observe many of the commandments that are associated with the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, and as well as other laws such as the Jubilee year. And that will be rectified with the coming of Mashiach. That's why we do not have a fifth cup that we drink, although there is a custom to drink a fifth cup. But we all do have the cup of Eliyahu, and it has been suggested, although there's some controversy about that, that the fifth cup is drunk by Eliyahu because he is the one who will announce the coming of Mashiach, the ultimate and final redemption. Well, Moses now comes before Pharaoh and performs the miracles. The staff turns into a snake. Pharaoh was unimpressed. He had his own magicians. They could also do tricks, not quite as incredible as the ones that Moses did, but he wasn't impressed by tricks. What did impress him? Well, nothing really impressed him until after the 10 plagues. And that raises a question. If God wanted Pharaoh to let the Jews go, he could have just performed the 10th plague first, or a similar devastating plague that would have once and for all convinced Pharaoh that he better not start up with the God of Israel and let the Jews go. However, God says, no, I'm going to do it one step at a time. These 10 plagues are not 10 forms of punishment, although he deserved the punishment, but they are 10 steps, a 10-step therapy. It was an educational process. There were 10 grades here. Let's go through some of them at least. The first plague we all know was dam, blood. The water turned into blood. The water of the Nile River turned into blood. What is the significance of that? Before you could change someone, a person has bad habits. A person is a prisoner of his habits. He's addicted to something negative. The first thing you have to do is to undermine the very foundation of their lifestyle. You have to show them that their God, that they worship, and yes, the Egyptians worshiped the Nile, and today people worship many aspects of modern society, whether it's Hollywood, whether it's wealth, whether it's power, whichever it is, that is another pagan god that people worship today. And in order to get rid of all the negatives in our lives, we have to get rid of the false gods. The Nile was worshipped because it was the source of sustenance for all of Egypt. And when the Nile River turned into blood, it crushed, it destroyed their respect for the Nile. It was no longer an invincible force. It was no longer their god. And now they were on the road to changing their whole way of thinking. Then you have a second plague, which is the plague of frogs coming out of the Nile. That also was to strike the Nile. But why do you need 2 plagues to strike the same pagan worship of the Nile? One way of explaining it is that the first plague demonstrated to them that the Nile is not God. The Nile, when it was water, was able to nurture the entire country's agricultural output. Without the water of the Nile, they would not have any crops. And now that the Nile turned into blood, that was the end of their God. It no longer could do what it was intended to do. But nevertheless, people are not only attached to something based on their understanding, there's an emotional attachment. The second plague, which produced the disgusting frogs which came all over, jumped into their mouths, they swallowed the frogs, they went wherever they could possibly go, that made them have this negative feeling towards their god, the Nile River. So you first have to destroy the idol by discrediting it, showing it that it doesn't have the power, but you still can't take a person away from an idol unless you also take away the feelings for it. Those are the first two plagues. Then we get to the third plague, the plague of lice. What was unique about that plague? While the first two plagues were pretty powerful, the Egyptians were able to replicate it. They were able to turn water into blood and produce frogs out of the water. But when it came to the third plague of lice, they couldn't do it. And our sages tell us that the reason for that is the power of magic can only do things with things that are larger than the size of a barley grain. The lice that are smaller than a barley grain could not be replicated by the Egyptian sorcerers. What does that teach us? In the realm of evil, in the realm of falsehood, big is what makes a difference. Small is insignificant. One doesn't get excited about small incremental steps. If you want to get out of your Egypt, by the way, we discussed last week the word in Hebrew for Egypt, Mitzrayim, means straits, confinement. If you want to get out of your prison, your confinement, you have to, first of all, get rid of the gods, both intellectually and emotionally, and then you have to realize that every little step counts, that God cherishes small, incremental steps. Every mitzvah that we do has infinite value. Don't underestimate the power of even small things. When you see someone cherishing small, you know that that person is associated with the one God. When you see people who only worship the big, you know they're dealing with pagan gods. Of course, we have nothing against big things, but God is as much present in the smallest and the most apparently insignificant things as he is in the big things. God transcends big and small, so for him to be present in the small is no less of a feat, no less of a godly act than if he is present in the big. So those are the first three plagues: the destruction of the God, intellectually, emotionally, and then the next step is recognizing that small steps have meaning and value. There are other plagues, but we're not going to go through all the plagues right now. But there's a general question that Maimonides raises, and it's an obvious question. Throughout the 10 plagues, 7 of which are mentioned in this week's Torah portion, 3 in next week's Torah portion, which raises a separate question why they are separated into 2 sections. We'll discuss that next week, God willing. But throughout these plagues, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Sometimes he hardens his own heart, but sometimes God hardens his heart. Well, how could you punish someone when they're not in control of their decisions, when God hardens their heart? That's the question Maimonides asks. And there are many answers to that question. One answer to the question Maimonides himself gives is that hardening of the heart by God was actually part of his punishment for all of the evil he did before that. This is how it works. A person does something wrong, commits a crime, is involved in something evil, and they don't change. So it causes them to repeat it again. And every time you repeat the crime, the sin, the transgression, you become more and more desensitized to how negative it is. And it reaches a point, and this is the consequence of your actions and as well as the punishment, that you lose control of yourself and you no longer have the ability to change. Your heart is hardened. And the punishment is that since your heart is hardened, you do not change, and once you reach the point of critical mass of evil, God then punishes the person, and there's no way of returning. So a person has to recognize that when they do something wrong, repeating it over and over again actually makes it more and more difficult for them to change. So that's Maimonides' take, that yes, God hardened his heart because that was his punishment. That was the consequence of his own hardening of his heart over the period of who knows how many years of showing insensitivity to the plight of his slaves. That's one answer. Another answer that is given is that God gave him the trait of stubbornness, tenacity. He's obstinate. When a person is in Hebrew, the word is akshin, stiff-necked. That isn't a positive or negative trait. It can be used in either direction. So if a person has a trait that they are stubborn by nature, you shouldn't tell the person, that's a terrible trait, you should get rid of it, you should become soft and pliable and flexible. Because who says it's good to be flexible about things that are of utmost importance, of value? Instead, you should say to the person, yes, you want to be stubborn, you want to be stiff-necked, use it for something positive. Use it, be stubborn about your commitment to values. Don't compromise on things that are against the Torah, against decency and morality. Be stubborn about resisting evil. Be stubborn about doing good, even when you don't feel like doing good. You don't feel like helping someone. You go against your nature. That stubbornness is positive. So God just endowed Pharaoh with the power to be stubborn, and Pharaoh could have used it one way or another. He could have used it, I'm going to let those Jews go no matter what my ministers tell me, no matter what the government that I control tells me is good for Egypt, no matter what the economists say is going to be devastating if we let the slaves go. I am just going to do the right thing. Or he could have used his stubbornness, as he did in the end, to say, I don't care how much I'm going to suffer, I will not let them go. And of course he chose to use stubbornness. So he didn't lose his free choice, he just used his free choice the wrong way. And the third answer is one that the Rebbe gives, that no matter how hard God makes it for a person to change, they can always change by going deep into their psyche, into their soul, and they could find the spark of goodness and of holiness that will enable them to overcome all the obstacles, even the obstacles imposed on us by God himself. That is an incredible idea, that even Pharaoh, even though he was not someone who you would say was steeped in holiness at any point in his life, but even he had this spark of divinity in him, the spark of goodness, and if he had used his free choice, he could have found it within himself to overcome the obstacles, including the obstacles that God himself puts in our way. The Talmud tells a story of one of the great sages who started off as a great sage, whose name was Elisha ben Avuya, and he became a heretic, and he was nicknamed Acher, the other one. And he was a teacher of another great sage, Rabbi Meir, who would follow him on Shabbos as the teacher was riding his horse, which is a violation of the laws of Shabbos, but he rejected all of Judaism. And Rabbi Meir was walking along with him and listening to his teaching, because he still had this brilliant knowledge. At one point, the teacher says, Meir, go back, because we're not allowed to walk outside of the city limits more than 2,000 cubits, which is about a half a mile. And he had measured the steps as they were going. So he tells Meir, go back, which meant physically go back to where you came from, because you're not allowed to walk any further. And Rabbi Meir took this opportunity to say to Acher, what about you? Why don't you come back? And he meant that not just in the physical sense, he meant that in the spiritual sense. Because he saw that he had some spark of holiness left in him, that he was still teaching Torah. He had this love for the knowledge of Torah. And Acher says, no, it's too late for me, because there's a heavenly voice that comes out of Mount Sinai every day. And this heavenly voice says, return, you errant children, return. It says, when I hear that voice, there's also a caveat. Return, my children, return, except for Acher. He cannot return. Well, if God himself tells me I cannot return, then I am doomed. There's nothing I can do to go back. And he was mistaken. What was his mistake? God could make all sorts of obstacles. Sometimes the obstacles are financial. Sometimes the obstacles are emotional. Sometimes they're intellectual. Sometimes you have a tyrant who poses an obstacle for you. But sometimes God himself tells you, I reject you, you cannot come back into my home. And at that point, you're supposed to say to God, I will not accept that. God wants you to overcome even that obstacle. There's an expression of the Talmud, whenever you're a guest in someone's home, whatever the host tells you to do, you should do, except if he tells you to go out. Once he invites you in his house, you don't have to listen to him when he tells you to go out. And the Rebbe would say, this is what God does with us. He's the host, we're the guest. Whatever he tells us to do, we have to do, even if it's uncomfortable. But if he tells us to get out of his home, we don't have to accept that. We don't ever have to accept being rejected, even when God himself says he's rejecting us. We can always come back. And the lesson, incredibly, is to be derived from Pharaoh himself. No, someone as lowly as Pharaoh, even he could have come back, but he chose not to. And that's why he was punished for it. So, in the final analysis, the 10 plagues were an educational process to teach the Egyptians and the Jewish people about God's greatness, how he values every little act, how he has a special love and affection for the Jewish people. That's what the 4th plague, which the Torah says only applied to the Egyptians, and the Jews were not included in that. That showed how much he cared for the Jewish people and how much power he had to control all of the forces of nature. Have a good Shabbos and a good week.